The topic for today's plenary is really what is at the heart of the Innovation Island Summit. After a historic economic crisis in 2022, there has been an unexpected recovery from the crisis, and Sri Lanka is back to business. It has set a goal to become a high-income economy by 2048, which is the centenary year of its independence. It also is an interesting time for us to be having this conversation. The Sri Lankan government has just released its budget in the last week, and that budget has been very closely tracked and watched. It was the first since the newly elected government was elected last year. And of course, it would lay the groundwork for long-term reforms for the economy. In this discussion, we will look at both opportunities and challenges in the post-restructuring phase that Sri Lanka is in, and the lessons that economies can draw from it. We have 30 minutes for the conversation, and I'm really privileged to be having this conversation with Hans Wijaysurya and Dishal Demel, who are at the forefront of bringing in digital and economic reforms in the country. Hans, I'm going to start with you. You have been intrinsic to the effort of building Sri Lanka's digital economy. And just for context of the audience, Sri Lanka is betting big on the digital economy. There is a newly established Ministry of Digital Economy, along with the goal of growing the digital economy to $15 billion over the next 5 years. And the foundation for digital public infrastructure is also being laid. Can you tell us what are the principal ideas and goals of the strategy?
Thanks, and very good evening. Honor and privilege to be here. I think the first precept that the government of Sri Lanka is following in structuring the digital economy acceleration effort is to take a whole of economy view, meaning that digital not seen simply as technology or systems or tools, but more looking at digital as an accelerator of the entire economy. Now, Sri Lanka's digital economy today is 2 to 3% of the total economy, whereas our aspiration is to get to north of 12%. And I think India, for example, is targeting 18 to 20% by 2030. Our aspirations are to get closer to 15% in terms of digital economy as a part of the whole economy. Now, why is that important? I think global examples, global correlation that we see shows that the deeper digital penetration goes into the broader economy, whether it be into industry or into services or pure digital platforms, the deeper you go, the higher the uplift you get on GDP growth. So that a country which is growing at business as usual rate of, say, 4%, could aspire to anywhere between 5 and 6%, depending on the penetration of the digital economy. And so that's where the government, in invigorating the private sector, providing the platforms, digital public infrastructure, for example, providing the open interface and also the open and enabling environment to enable digital transformation of multiple industries, to enable digital transformation of government services, with a keen eye on inclusion to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind, that we actually bridge the existing divides and ensure that going forward, that we carry the entire population along this journey, build infrastructure and promote new tech and innovation. So these are some of the key pillars of this strategy.
So you mentioned how India is betting on 18%, Sri Lanka is looking at 12% in the next few years. And we are at a conference where international cooperation is really the big theme. What do you see the role of technology partnerships? How can Sri Lanka work with like-minded stakeholders on this?
I think digital is a regional, if not global, landscape. So there's no restriction in terms of knowledge sharing, in terms of technology sharing, as well as sharing of experience. And in particular, I think being a neighbor of India, we would learn a lot from India's story and journey over the last few years. Having said that, we also have to recognize that each country has a different context. Sri Lanka, for instance, could be seen to be ahead on certain dimensions of this digital equation. For example, telecommunications penetration, mobile penetration of over 120%, the penetration of networks. Likewise, the islands of excellence we have in several industries and service areas of government. But where we need to work harder is on the horizontals of the interoperability and interconnections between various sectors and institutions. So that's where Sri Lanka would focus on, bringing together established strengths, bringing in horizontal infrastructures like DPI, building on the strengths of broadband and connectivity infrastructure the country already has to ensure that there's an inclusive fabric of digital CUM infrastructure coming together to further the economy along the digital dimension.
Dishal, for you, I have what may be an obvious question, but I think this is something which would be very relevant for all of us. To what do you attribute the sooner than expected turnaround in the Sri Lankan economy? Is there a new economic model, and also are there guardrails to sustain it?
Thank you, Sunena, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to speak. It's a real pleasure and an honor. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Look, I think when we speak about Sri Lanka's economic recovery, it's probably in two parts. The first, the path from a very deep, complex economic crisis to a situation of stability, which is, I think, where we're at right now. But that story of recovery is probably not complete until we also have the growth in the equation as well. So I think we have come to that first stage where we've come to a level where we have stabilized. And yes, it is, I would say that our experience of achieving the stability has been quite fast, and I think faster than a lot of people expected, including internally as well. In terms of the kind of ingredients that went into that, I wouldn't say it's some special new model. It is really kind of just going back to basics of macroeconomic management. But what was done was there was a fairly comprehensive and holistic approach to reform. In the past, Sri Lanka has tried to take a more incremental approach with regard to reform agendas. But here the crisis was so deep that there was no option but to have a very comprehensive, both in terms of time frame and in terms of coverage. So in terms of coverage, it was the entire span of the key drivers of vulnerability we attempted to address, whether it's fiscal policy, monetary policy, financial sector reforms, welfare reforms, debt sustainability. All of that was done in parallel. And that was obviously very difficult to do because it stretched institutional capacity, implementation capacity to the maximum. But it also had to be done because, again, because of the interlinkages between those different elements, it was not feasible to do, say, just monetary policy reforms without addressing the stability of the banking sector, because you would have had a knock-on effect. So that is that first element, the fact that it was comprehensive across sectors. Also the fact that a lot of the most difficult reforms were front-loaded. So we had the most, say, politically unpopular measures, increases in taxation, cost-reflective pricing of energy, increases in interest rates. All of that was very, very much front-loaded, so that the pain was deep but felt up front, and then gradually it can ease. And so those are kind of tough decisions, but I think those have paid off, judging by the outcomes so far. And I would say that two other elements. One was the cooperation that we deliberately entered into with international partners and also multilateral agencies. India, in particular, played a key role as one of the co-chairs of the Official Creditor Committee in Sri Lanka's debt restructuring. So we always acknowledge that, and then also engagement with international groups such as the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, ADB, and all of that. So having that, again, holistic approach really supported the country in kind of getting to where we are. The final point, I think probably one of the most important points, is the fact that even across multiple political cycles, the core of those reforms were able to continue. And again, this is at odds with Sri Lanka's past. In the past, we've seen political change also brings a complete turnaround or a reversal of reforms. In this situation, we saw an acknowledgement of the importance of continuity of those core macroeconomic fundamentals, and I think that has really enabled or helped us to come to where we are today.
So earlier today in the curtain raiser session, there was talk around Sri Lanka's strategic location and how it makes it a very key player in international trade. And of course, also in this year's budget, there is talk about increasing FTAs with different geographies and regions. So how do you think Sri Lanka can go about improving its standing in international trade? And what are the advantages and also the challenges?
Absolutely. So I think, again, one of the, as I said, the second part of the recovery would be in terms of driving recovery of growth as well. And also what we want to see is a qualitative change in that growth. Again, historically, if you look at Sri Lanka's post-war context, most of the growth has been driven by the domestic sector. Whereas I think we also need to see a greater degree of non-debt creating inflows. So exports of goods, exports of services, FDI, all that will become important to really support the longer term recovery of the economy. And in that context, obviously trade becomes a crucial aspect of it. And within that, Sri Lanka's locational advantage obviously plays a very, very important role. The fact that we are a relatively small market of 22 million people, GDP of about $95 billion, makes it important that the investment that we attract is likely to be investment that is outward oriented or market seeking, looking to tap into markets in the south, in the Indian subcontinent and so on. So I think that is an important conduit or an important avenue for drivers of future growth in the country. And again, towards that, there have been, Sri Lanka has for a while been trying to deepen its trade agreements. So we have two fairly basic trade agreements with India and Pakistan, but more recently we've had more comprehensive engagements with Singapore and Thailand. Going forward, the new government's intention is to review some of these agreements and then to see how we can move forward with newer agreements as well. But I would think that is going to be a fundamental driver of the growth of trade, the growth of exports, growth of investment into the country. Because it's really what we've seen globally as well in, say, the ASEAN region, in regions like Europe. It is the predictability and the transparency of trading institutions. So that's the rules of the game, which are really underpinned by this kind of agreements that really enables the confidence for investors to set up, for traders to set up and to make those long-term plays. So I would see that as a really fundamental role for Sri Lanka's future direction.
Hans, you were just talking about Sri Lanka's approach to digital public infrastructure, which is also unique in its own way. And one of the themes for our conference also is looking at emerging technologies. So when we look at DPI and we look at emerging technologies like AI, how do you see the two working together for sustainable growth, for inclusive growth?
So DPIs, or digital public infrastructure, they are intrinsically open infrastructures, not vendor locked, they are not restrictive or compartmentalized. So in that sense, they are intrinsically inclusive. They are also open sourced. Therefore, there's open innovation which can take place on top of digital public infrastructures. For those who in the audience, you might like to have some introduction to what DPIs are. A digital ID, for example, is a key digital public infrastructure. The payment networks in a country, key digital public infrastructure. Likewise, in Sri Lanka, we have established a data protection authority and a private personal data protection act. And in concert, the authority and the new legislation enables an infrastructure, a DPI such as the National Data Exchange, to facilitate the exchange of information between government institutions as well as between citizens and government and vice versa. So this brings in that horizontal interoperability which I spoke about earlier. So these are all blocks. Another would be verifiable credentials. For instance, our driving license. could be a digital verifiable credential, exam certificates, or any form of certificate which needs to be digitally signed could sit in a wallet with the citizen. Likewise for businesses, various forms of licenses that businesses get, again, could be digitally signed and incorporated in a wallet belonging to that business. So you can envisage a future, in the not too distant future actually, where everyone can participate in a digital ecosystem where information is shared, where certificates are shared, where your credentials are shared, and where your identity enables you to work in cyberspace very seamlessly. You spoke about AI. I think AI is, I would say, disrupting nearly every sphere of digital. So there are opportunities and there are threats, because on one hand, you'll be enabling tasks to be carried out much cheaper, much faster, and with far less complication. On the other hand, there would be a displacement of digital ecosystems. Traditionally, man-delivered or human-delivered processors would now move to AI. AI itself would have or come with it the challenges of governance and the need for a focus on ethics around the use of AI. So these are all topics that we are incorporating within the institutional framework as well as the policy framework, and backed by new legislation which is in the making. So when I mentioned it's a whole of economy approach, because tech in isolation is not really the problem. Tech is getting cheaper and cheaper, it's getting more and more capable. But what are the surrounding infrastructures, such as DPI, such as the institutions, the legislation, capacity building, inclusion principles, ethics, governance, and very importantly, digital trust. We need to trust all of this innovation and ways of doing things going forward.
So Dishal, if we can turn briefly to the debt crisis. And Sri Lanka completed its debt restructuring by December. What lessons would you say island nations can draw and also learn from the Sri Lankan crisis to mitigate high debt burdens?
Yeah, so I think the first and most important lesson is to act early, which is something that we unfortunately did not do. We waited till probably too late before trying to restructure our debt. We waited to a situation where our forex reserves had effectively run out, and then there was no choice, but we just had to have a moratorium on our payments unilaterally implemented. And that's really not the best way to go about it, because you're going into the situation from a very difficult negotiating position. So I think the first lesson is really to act fast, act preemptively wherever possible. And then I would say secondly, again, to take as comprehensive an approach as possible. Again, Sri Lanka's debt is fairly complex. We have a number of different creditors, official bilateral creditors, private creditors, then kind of in between those, the in between areas, domestic creditors. It's a very complex pool. So again, the fact that it was important to take a comprehensive approach to that, which is, as I said, very similar to the overall reforms, challenging because it stretches your institutional capacity, it stretches your negotiating capacity a great deal. But I think that approach again makes sense, because you're able to tackle the entire beast without trying to take it in a piecemeal approach. The other, again, similar point to what I made earlier, the importance of engaging with your international partners. So Sri Lanka was fortunate that our external official creditors formed into largely a single group, the Official Creditor Committee, 17 countries co-chaired by the governments of Japan, India, and France. The government of China negotiated separately, and then we had our private creditors and the domestic creditors outside of that. So having that kind of those platforms certainly helped, and for some of the low-income countries, there are existing platforms for that, like the common framework. But being a middle-income country, we didn't have that, so we had to kind of chart a separate course. Then again, I think just trying to be as open, transparent as possible, not trying to have different terms with different people, different groups of creditors, approaching it in a good faith manner. That's it can be difficult because it's obviously you can be much quicker if you try to do a separate deal with somebody else and try to do it in a kind of to try to take shortcuts, but that's not going to be sustainable. So I think that the approach where it probably took longer because of that more ensuring that comparability of treatment, transparency, equitability, all of that. I think that also paid off in terms of the final outcomes. So I think it's still a fairly evolving international architecture in terms of how sovereign debt restructuring is done. There is no set rules. I think for low-income countries, there's a little bit more clarity. For middle-income countries, Sri Lanka was probably the first to have gone through to this level. So, and there are again global multilateral forums that are trying to address some of the problems or the bottlenecks that we faced in terms of things like sharing of information, between creditors, that kind of intercreditor relations. So there is a global sovereign debt roundtable that is trying to address some of those challenges. So hopefully that path will become clearer as we go forward. But I think really the most important lesson is to act early and act in a comprehensive manner in order to get the best results.
Okay. So building on this question about island nations, and digital connectivity is, of course, critical for island nations. What would you say could be some of the foundational ideas that these states could look at to build and to be a part of the digital revolution?
So I think I try not to rely on the fact that we are an island. In the digital space, you need to be an island of excellence. Even if you are a large continent, island of excellence in a global landscape, because physical boundaries or whether you're physically connected or not matters less. Having said that, I think international connectivity then comes to the fore, and a parallel focus would be to ensure that Sri Lanka is connected to the globe with high capacity connectivities. Already Sri Lanka is connected to most of the international cables, and there isn't really a dearth of international capacity as we speak. But with the aspirations of the digital economy that we have, the multifold growth of digital utilization and therefore usage of data, the access to the internet and cloud services, etc., international connectivity will need to expand even going forward. The opportunities coming out of the data center space, for example, and from cloud investments, again, something nearly every country needs to concentrate on that, because in the cloud landscape, it's about having diversity and protection against single points of failure. And in that sense, I think any country would look to having fail-safe infrastructure outside their country as well. And in that, I think Sri Lanka, given its geolocation in this case, has the opportunity to secure some part of cloud investments in the world as well.
So the aspirations for the digital economy, and we were talking about the 12% earlier, what do you think will take Sri Lanka there?
I'm sorry.
If we can answer that quickly, what do you think will take Sri Lanka to the 12% mark that you are looking at?
A holistic approach. Sri Lanka has the talent. Sri Lanka has the skill base and the institutions, both private and public sector, to come together to make each piece interconnect and work towards that goal, both on the capacity building side as well as on innovation and with respect to infrastructure. But I think in any transformation, the challenge is change management. The challenge is mindset of institutions and individuals. And I think all countries that have gone through accelerated transformation have also had to grasp and conquer that challenge of change. And in fact, I would rate change management and transformation friction as equal, if not more important, than the technological challenges that you have.
I have one last question for both of you. Since innovation is the primary theme of this conference, in the digital economy and also in the economy, if there was one innovative proposal that you think should be adopted, what would it be?
I would anchor on the fact that digital is not constrained by physical. And therefore, if you take Sri Lanka, where certain aspects of the economic conditions, the fiscal space, at this point in time, might represent risks to, say, foreign investors. In the digital space, these risks and constraints do not exist. Therefore, from an innovation point of view, I would say we should look at virtual with respect to any form of investment. So why could we not have virtual infrastructure in which global investors can participate, Sri Lankan human capital and capability?
Right. And Dishal, what's yours?
Yeah, so quickly maybe to to try to touch on some of the themes of this topic of conference as well, trying to link in, say, financial innovations with some of the challenges that we face. So with regard to the threats that we face in terms of from climate change, from nature-related issues, to build in, to try to incorporate some of the financial innovations around that, debt for nature swaps, climate sustainability-related financial instruments, and so on. I think that can help solve probably two or more problems simultaneously. It's a big step from where we are right now, and it's kind of going from a stabilization to a far more advanced area. But I think that kind of innovation is what we really need to address some of the future external risks that we have, and also blend that in with addressing some of the physical challenges that we face as well.
Right. Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for joining us, Hans and Dishal.
Thank you.